The cardboard box weighed nothing compared to what she said next. Dean Ashford had just set the last box down at the threshold of her new apartment when Margot's hand closed around his arm, stopping him cold in the doorway. Her voice dropped, urgent, almost afraid of itself. "I should have chosen you. Not her sister's husband, not the man Renee married and later discarded. Him." Dean turned. The box braced against his hip, and saw something in her face he hadn't seen in 6 years. Not gratitude, not guilt. Recognition. Neither of them moved. Neither of them let go. That morning had started like any other Saturday, with Dean elbow-deep in a client's rotted porch railing when his phone buzzed against a paint can. Renee's name on the screen still did something small and automatic to his chest, even 3 years after the divorce papers had gone through. He wiped his hands on his jeans before answering, the way he always did, as if she could see through the phone. "My sister's moving into that place off Bull Street," Renee said, skipping any hello. "She's got no one down here yet, and I've got Grant's gala thing tonight, and you're good at this stuff. You always were." A pause, the kind that used to precede an apology and now precede nothing at all. "You'll do it, right?" He almost said no. He had every reason to, but Milo was already tugging at his sleeve, asking if they were going somewhere, and there was a version of Saturday where his son learned that helping people didn't require an invoice or an ex-wife's approval. So Dean said fine, the way he always did, and did not examine why. The address turned out to be a narrow 2-story walk-up 2 blocks from the river, brick softened by 100 years of humidity, the kind of building Dean could read the bones of without trying. A woman answered the door before he knocked dark eyes, a steadiness to her that didn't match the chaos of half-unpacked boxes behind her. "You must be the favor," she said, and there was an edge of apology in it, like she knew exactly how that sounded. "Dean," he said, "this is Milo. Margot." She looked at the boy first, not the man, crouching slightly to shake his small hand with a formality that made Milo grin. "Renee's sister. I promise I don't usually make people carry furniture up 2 flights before we're properly introduced. Renee didn't tell you my name? Renee told me you were reliable." A beat. She didn't say much else. That was, Dean thought, the most honest thing anyone in that family had said to him in years. They worked through the afternoon in the easy shorthand of people who don't know each other but know how to move a couch. Margot didn't ask what he did for a living beyond moving things, apparently, and he didn't ask what kept her at what she only called the county building downtown, mostly meetings. It struck him, faintly, that neither of them had offered more than that, and neither of them seemed to mind. Milo set up camp in the corner of the half-furnished living room with a sketch pad, drawing the bookshelf that hadn't been assembled yet, humming some tune from school. Margot brought him a juice box without being asked, crouched down to admire the drawing with real attention, not the performative kind adults reserve for other people's children. "He's sweet," she said quietly, straightening up. Renee never mentioned how sweet he was. Renee doesn't see him much. Dean kept his voice even. It wasn't a complaint, it was just true. Something crossed Margot's face, not pity, which he would have hated, but a kind of recalibration, like a woman revising a story she'd been told second-hand for years. She had grown up hearing about the marriage that fell apart, the husband who worked with his hands and couldn't keep up, the divorce that everyone privately blamed on him because that was easier than examining her sister. Watching him now, patient and unhurried with a boy who adored him, that story didn't fit anymore. By early evening, the boxes were stacked and the bookshelf stood upright, and Dean lingered a half-second too long at the door, box of tools under one arm, Milo already halfway to the truck. Margot stood in the frame of her new home, arms crossed loosely, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite name. "Thank you," she said. "Really. Any time." It wasn't a big moment. Nobody said anything they'd remember. Not yet. But something had shifted in the doorway that neither of them mentioned in the truck, or over dinner, or in the quiet after Milo fell asleep, a small current of attention that hadn't existed that morning and now, inexplicably, did. 3 days later, Margot walked the length of River Street with a clipboard and a county badge clipped to her blazer, doing the site survey she'd been dreading since her first week on the job. The preservation file for the block was thick with decades of half-finished paperwork, and her new title, Director of the Savannah Historic Preservation Commission, still felt borrowed, like a coat that hadn't been broken in. She was photographing a cornice when an old man, in a canvas apron, mortar dust on his forearms, wandered over from the scaffolding 2 buildings down. "You with the county?" he asked, squinting at her badge. "Margot Delaney. I'm reviewing the block for the demolition hearing." The man snorted, not unkindly. Somebody finally sending people who know what they're looking at. Most of them just walk through with a camera and a checklist. "I'm trying." She gestured at the brickwork above them. "This restoration work, it's remarkable. Whoever did the original repointing understood the building." "Ashford did it," the man said, like it was obvious. "Dean Ashford. Ran the whole outfit back then. D. Ashford Restoration Group, before he sold his stake. Man knew this street better than the county ever has. Rebuilt half these facades with his own 2 hands when the city wanted to bulldoze the lot back in, must have been 12 years now." Margot went very still. "Dean Ashford," she repeated, keeping her voice level though something in her chest had dropped several floors. "The same Dean Ashford who does contracting work now?" "Same fella. Quiet about it these days. Lost his wife not long after he stepped back. Architecture's a small world. Everybody knew. Nobody talked about it much, out of respect." The old man shrugged, already turning back toward his scaffold. "You didn't hear that from me." She thanked him and walked the rest of the block in a fog, her clipboard forgotten under her arm. That night, alone in her half-unpacked apartment, Margot pulled the county's digitized archive up on her laptop and searched the original permit filings for the block. It took 40 minutes to find it. Buried under 3 name changes and a corrupted scan, a set of restoration drawings from 12 years earlier, signed in a careful architect's hand. D. Ashford Restoration Group. The same year, she noted, that a Catherine Ashford's name appeared once in an obituary index and then nowhere else in Savannah's public record. She sat back from the screen, the apartment quiet around her, boxes still lining the walls like a life half arrived. The man who had carried her sofa up 2 flights of stairs without complaint, who had let his son draw quietly in the corner, who had said nothing about himself all afternoon, that man had built the very thing she'd been hired to save or condemn. It wasn't attraction, not exactly, not yet. It was something closer to vertigo, the sense of a door opening onto a room far larger than the one she'd assumed she was standing in. She thought of his hands on the box that afternoon, steady and unhurried, and understood, with a clarity that unsettled her, that she wanted to know the rest of what he wasn't saying. She closed the laptop before she could talk herself into calling him. For the better part of 2 weeks, Margot kept her distance the way careful people keep distance from things they're afraid of wanting. She buried herself in commission paperwork, took meetings that didn't need to be taken, told herself the site survey could wait until she'd read every scrap of the archive twice. It worked, mostly, until Milo's school sent home a flyer for a spring showcase, and somehow, through a chain of events she never fully understood, she ended up on the guest list. "Dad said you could sit with us," Milo announced when she arrived at the gymnasium, dragging her by the sleeve toward 2 folding chairs, as if the matter had already been settled by an 8-year-old's authority. She caught Dean's eye across the room, an apologetic half-smile, a small shrug that said he hadn't planned this either. They sat through 20 minutes of recorders and a shaky rendition of a folk song, shoulders inches apart, not touching, both acutely aware of the inches. Dean smelled like sawdust and clean laundry. Margot kept her hands folded in her lap like a woman keeping herself contained. "You've been busy," he said quietly, during a lull between songs. "Work," she said. "You know how it is." "Not really." "You've never told me what it is." She almost laughed the absurdity of it, the 2 of them tiptoeing around the plainest fact of themselves. "You've never told me either." He considered that, then let it go, the way he seemed to let most things go. and she found herself wondering if that patience was a virtue or a wound that had scarred over into a personality. She studied his profile in the dim gymnasium light, the careful way he tracked Milo through every song, clapping a beat behind everyone else because he was watching his son's face and not the stage. "Can I ask you something that isn't about work?" she said. "Depends on the something. Why do you still do this? Chaperone concerts. Carry boxes for strangers on a Saturday. You could say no to half of what people ask of you, and nobody would blame you." Dean considered the question longer than she expected. "Because saying yes is the only part of my life I still get to control completely," he said finally. "Everything else got decided for me at some point. Not this." She didn't press further, sensing the edge of something she wasn't owed yet, but she filed the answer away carefully, the way she'd started filing away every small, unguarded thing he gave her. Across the gym, Renee arrived late, scanning the crowd before her gaze landed on the two of them sitting together. Something flickered across her face, not jealousy exactly, something colder and more calculating, gone before Margot could read it fully. Renee waved, mouthed a hello, and did not come sit with them. Afterward, in the parking lot, Margot caught a fragment of Renee's voice on the phone, low and clipped, the word Grant surfacing twice before she noticed Margot within earshot and lowered her voice further. She didn't think much of it until the following Thursday, when the Commission's quarterly gala brought half the city's development money into one ballroom, and Grant Wexler was introduced to her for the first time as Renee's husband and a tremendous friend to this city's growth. He had the practiced warmth of a man who had learned exactly how much charm a room required and delivered precisely that much, no more. "Director Delaney," he said, shaking her hand a beat too long. "I've heard good things. I hope you'll keep an open mind about River Street. That block's been a drain on the city for a decade. Time to let it become something useful. I intend to review it thoroughly," she said, careful and neutral. "Of course." His smile didn't move. "I'm sure you will." Later that night, back at her desk, unable to sleep, Margot found herself scrolling through a leaked internal memo one of her staffers had forwarded without much comment, a stakeholder list for the River Street redevelopment proposal, names sorted by category. Under a heading that read, in flat corporate language, "Anticipated opposition requires management," she found a single name near the bottom. D. Ashford. She read it 3 times before she understood what she was looking at. The weeks that followed felt to Margot like standing on 2 shifting plates of ground at once. By day, she was the newly appointed director of a commission that held the fate of an entire historic block in its hands, and by every other hour she was a woman who kept finding reasons to walk past a certain contractor's storefront, kept noticing the particular tilt of his laugh through Milo's open bedroom window when she dropped off a forgotten sketchpad, kept lying awake turning over the plain, uncomfortable fact that she wanted to protect him and was terrified of what wanting that might cost her. She went to see Opal Whitfield on a Tuesday, ostensibly for the block's oral history file, actually because she needed to talk to someone who had lived on that street longer than the paperwork had existed. Opal's porch smelled of cut grass and orange peco tea, and the old woman studied Margot for a long moment before offering her a chair. "You're the one asking around about Ashford," Opal said. "It wasn't a question. I'm asking about the block." Opal poured the tea slowly, unhurried in the way of people who have already decided how much they intend to say. "I worked the old planning office for 30 years, back when your commission was 3 men in a basement with a coffee pot. I knew Dean when he still had ink under his fingernails instead of sawdust. Brilliant, that boy. Married a good woman, too. Catherine." "What happened?" Opal's face closed, gently but completely, the door shutting on a room Margot understood she wasn't invited into yet. "That's not mine to tell." She set the teapot down. "But I'll tell you this much. Since you're asking the right question even if you don't know it yet, there are numbers in that old commission file that never added up, repointing costs on paper that don't match what got spent on that block. Somebody skimmed something a long time ago And it never got looked at because the man who could have proven it walked away from architecture and never looked back. Do you know who? I know enough to be careful, Opal said, which Margot was beginning to understand was the closest thing to an answer the old woman intended to give. Margot lingered on the porch a moment longer, watching a hummingbird work the feeder hanging from Opal's eave. You said you knew Dean when he was still an architect. What was he like, back then? Opal's expression softened, some old fondness surfacing despite herself. Hungry. In the good way. He used to sketch that block on napkins before he ever had a client for it just because he thought it deserved saving. Catherine used to tease him that he loved these old buildings more than he loved sleep. She paused, teacup halfway to her lips. He hasn't sketched anything in years, far as I know. Not since. What changed? Grief has a way of making a man distrust the thing he used to love most, if that thing reminds him too much of who he was before he lost someone. Opal set the cup down with a small, final clink. You do well to remember that, before you go falling for whatever's left of him. Margot didn't answer that, because she didn't yet have an answer that felt honest. She left with more questions than she'd arrived with, and drove, without quite deciding to, toward Dean's house instead of her own. He answered the door in a paint-stained shirt, Milo's laughter drifting from the kitchen behind him, and something in his face eased when he saw her, unguarded in a way she hadn't seen since the day she'd grabbed his arm without meaning to. We're making a mess of spaghetti, he said. You're welcome to it, if you can stomach Milo's garlic bread theories. She should have said no. She said yes. Dinner was loud and easy and entirely without agenda. Milo narrating an elaborate theory about why garlic bread needed exactly 4 different cheeses. Dean rolling his eyes with visible affection, the kitchen warm with the smell of butter and basil. Nobody mentioned commissions or contracts or the block on River Street. For an hour, Margot let herself simply exist in the small orbit of this family that wasn't hers, and it frightened her how easily she fit. She drove home with her chest tight, guilt sitting where warmth had been an hour before. She had eaten his food, laughed at his son's jokes, and said nothing about the memo with his name on it, nothing about the ground shifting beneath the street he'd built with his own hands. It wasn't dishonesty exactly. It was cowardice wearing dishonesty's coat, and she knew the difference even as she let it stand. Grant summoned her to his office the following Monday, and Margot understood, the moment she sat down across from his obscenely large desk, that the meeting had nothing to do with courtesy. I want the River Street vote moved up, he said, without preamble. Council's ready. The commission's dragging its feet, and frankly, Director, dragging feet makes this city look weak to investors. The survey isn't complete. The survey's complete enough. His smile stayed fixed, but something colder moved behind his eyes. You're new to this seat, Margot. I'd hate for your first year to be remembered as the one where you cost this city $40 million in development because of some sentimental attachment to old bricks. Is that a threat? It's context. He leaned back, steepling his fingers, the picture of a reasonable man being patient with an unreasonable one. You know, I was the one who suggested your name to the council. Renee mentioned her sister was looking for a fresh start, somewhere warmer, somewhere with opportunity. I made a call. I vouched for you personally, before anyone here knew your name. I didn't realize I owed you my career. Nobody owes anybody anything in this business. His smile didn't reach his eyes. But relationships matter, Director. Gratitude matters. It's a small city, and reputations travel fast in rooms you haven't been invited into yet. This council appointed you. This council can revisit that appointment. She left his office with her hands shaking, not from fear exactly, but from the particular fury of realizing how small a leash she'd been given without noticing the caller. She called Renee that evening, half hoping for reassurance, and got instead a distracted, hurried voice that kept circling back to Grant's schedule, Grant's mood, whether Margot had upset him. He mentioned you seemed resistant, Renee said. Just try to be easier with him, okay? He's been so good to us. Renee. Did you know he wanted me on that commission specifically because I just moved down here? Because I didn't know anyone yet? A silence stretched long enough to answer the question on its own. "It wasn't like that," Renee said finally, unconvincingly. "He just said it'd be good for you to be closer to family. Closer to," she stopped herself. "Closer to Dean," Margot finished. "So, you could keep tabs." So he could. Renee didn't deny it. That, more than anything Grant had said in his office, was what finally hardened something in Margot's chest. She had been placed, like a piece on a board, without anyone thinking to tell her she was playing a game at all. She hung up, sat alone in the dark of her apartment, and made a decision that felt less like courage than necessity. She would find out everything, and she would trust no one's version of the story but the papers. Opal Whitfield showed up at Margot's office 3 days later without calling ahead, a canvas tote bag clutched to her chest like something fragile. She waited until Margot's assistant had closed the door before she spoke. "I made a promise to my husband before he passed," Opal said, sitting stiffly in the visitor's chair. 20 years, I kept it. But I watched that boy carry boxes up 2 flights of stairs for a woman he'd never met, and I watched you chase down the truth instead of taking the easy road, and I decided some promises aren't worth keeping, if keeping them lets the wrong man win." She opened the tote bag and set a battered notebook on the desk, its cover soft with age, followed by a manila folder thick with printed emails. "My husband ran procurement for the planning office back when River Street first got its repointing contract. He kept records nobody asked him to keep because he didn't trust the man overseeing the budget." She tapped the folder. That man was Grant Wexler, back when he was still climbing, still 20 years from a council seat. He inflated the repointing costs by better than 60% and pocketed the difference through a shell contractor. When Dean's firm caught the discrepancy in an internal audit, Grant made sure Dean got quietly pushed out of every future commission meeting before he could bring it to the city. Called it a conflict of interest concern. It wasn't. It was a man protecting a theft that would have ended his career before it started. Margot's hands went cold around the folder's edge. This is 12 years old. Grant's been rebuilding that whole street's reputation as a liability ever since, so nobody would ever look close enough to notice the numbers don't add up. And when Renee mentioned she had a sister moving to Savannah with no connections, yet Opal's mouth thinned. He saw an opportunity. Install someone new, someone grateful, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions before the demolition vote. "He didn't count on you actually doing your job." Margot sat with that for a long, silent moment, the weight of it rearranging everything she thought she understood about her own arrival in this city, Renee's phone call, the apartment 2 blocks from Dean's neighborhood, the commission seat that had felt, at the time, like remarkable luck. "He used my sister to use me," she said slowly, "to bury the same man he already screwed once." "Sounds about right," Opal said. Margot sat with the folder long after Opal left, the office growing dark around her, and reached for her phone 3 separate times before finally dialing Dean's number. It rang twice. She hung up before the 3rd ring, throat tight, unable to find the sentence that could hold everything she now knew. She drove to his house instead the following evening, arriving as the porch light flicked on against the dusk, Milo's bicycle abandoned in the yard. Dean opened the door, already sensing something was wrong. She could see it settle into his shoulders before she'd said a word. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." He stepped back to let her in, and she talked for 20 straight minutes without sitting down the commission seat. The memo, with his name flagged as opposition to manage, Opal's notebook, the folder of emails, Grant's arrangement with Renee that had placed her, unknowing, 2 blocks from his front door. She told him everything, including the dinner she'd eaten at his table, already knowing half of it, including the guilt that had kept her from saying anything sooner. Dean listened without interrupting, his face unreadable in a way that frightened her more than anger would have. When she finished, he was quiet long enough that she thought she'd lost something she hadn't fully realized she wanted to keep. "You knew," he said finally, "and you sat at my table anyway. I know how that looks. It looks like Renee. It looks exactly like every version of being used I already lived through with her family." His voice wasn't raised, which somehow made it worse. "Milo likes you. I let my son like you. I didn't come here to lie to you, Dean. I came here because I found out the truth and I couldn't keep sitting on it, not even to protect myself." Her voice cracked slightly, and she let it, because pretending otherwise felt like one more small dishonesty she didn't have room for. "I could lose my job for what I'm about to do. I'm bringing this to the commission whether Grant likes it or not, and I wanted you to hear it from me before you heard it in a hearing room." Something in his face shifted. The anger, not gone but recalculated, weighed against the fact that she had walked into his house and handed him the one thing Renee never had the whole truth, unasked for, at real cost to herself. From the hallway, Milo appeared in pajamas, drawn by the tension in the house the way children always are, his small face creased with worry he didn't have words for yet. Dean crossed the room in 2 steps and crouched down to his level. "Everything's okay, bud," he said gently. "Grown-up stuff. Go on back to bed. I'll come tuck you in." Milo nodded, still uncertain, and padded back down the hall, glancing once over his shoulder at Margot before disappearing. Dean straightened, looked at her for a long moment, and something in his shoulders finally loosened. "Show me the folder," he said. They spent the next 3 hours at his kitchen table, spreading Opal's notebook and the printed emails across the wood, building the timeline together, the inflated invoices, the shell contractor, the quiet exile from every commission meeting that mattered. Dean's hands, steady on a box of moving supplies weeks earlier, were steady now too, though something behind his eyes had gone very still, the particular stillness of a man revisiting a wound he'd spent years walking around. "The hearing's in 5 days," Margot said. "I want to bring this forward myself, officially, on the record. They'll come after your job. They'll try." She met his eyes. "I'd rather lose it doing the right thing than keep it doing his." Dean studied her for a moment, something unspoken passing between them that neither had language for yet, and nodded once. "Then we do it together." Grant found out about the meeting 2 days before the hearing, the way powerful men always find out things through a nervous junior staffer who mentioned, in passing, that Director Delaney had requested archival procurement records dating back 12 years. He called Margot into his office within the hour, all warmth stripped from his face this time. "You're making a mistake," he said. "I can make your career here very difficult or very easy. Your choice." "I've already made my choice," Margot said, and left before he could finish whatever threat he'd prepared next. The hearing room was fuller than Margot had ever seen it, word having traveled the particular way it does in a city small enough for everyone to know everyone's business. She stood at the podium with Opal's folder in hand, her voice steady though her pulse wasn't, and laid out 12 years of buried numbers in front of the full commission, the council, liaisons, and a scattering of local reporters who had smelled a story before anyone told them there was one. Dean sat in the front row, not called to speak yet, Milo safely at a neighbor's for the evening. When Margot reached the part of her testimony requiring verification of the original restoration drawings, she looked up and asked him, formally, on the record, to confirm his identity as the architect of record. He stood, and for the first time in 12 years, said his own name in a public room without flinching from it. "I'm Dean Ashford. I designed and oversaw the original restoration of the River Street block. I can confirm every drawing in that file is mine, and every discrepancy in the budget that followed was raised by my firm and buried by the man overseeing procurement." A murmur moved through the room like wind through grass. Grant stood from the council section, face composed but color rising at his collar. "This is a coordinated attack by a disgruntled former contractor and a director who's clearly compromised by a personal relationship with him. I'd ask the commission to consider the source before considering the accusation." "The source," Margot said, before anyone else could respond, "is a 12-year paper trail kept by a man who didn't trust you the moment he met you. I'd invite the commission to consider that instead." Near the back of the room, Renee had come in quietly sometime during the testimony, arms crossed against her chest, expression unreadable. Grant looked to her, some silent appeal in his face, expecting the reflexive loyalty of years of marriage. Renee held his gaze for a long moment and then looked away from him, toward her sister at the podium, and said nothing at all, which everyone in the room understood as its own kind of answer. The commission chair, visibly rattled by the size of the crowd and the weight of the folder now sitting in front of her, called for a recess to review the documents formally before any vote could proceed. The room exhaled collectively, the tension not broken so much as suspended, and Margot stepped down from the podium on legs that didn't entirely feel like her own. Dean met her in the hallway outside the chamber, the fluorescent light unkind to both of them, adrenaline still trembling faintly in her hands. "You did that," he said. "All of it. On the record, in front of the whole council." "I almost didn't." She pressed her palms flat against her thighs to still them. "Halfway through, I looked up and saw Grant's face and thought, he could still end my career tonight, and I kept talking anyway." "Why?" "Because the alternative was watching you get erased a second time, and telling myself it wasn't my problem." She met his eyes. "It stopped being not my problem the day you carried my sofa up 2 flights of stairs." Dean didn't say anything to that, not right away. He reached out instead and took her hand, briefly, just long enough to still it completely, and let go before either of them had to decide what the gesture meant in a public hallway with reporters 20 feet away. The reconvened hearing took place 4 days later, the room somehow even fuller, reporters now openly present with notepads instead of pretending to be there for something else. The commission chair read the findings of an emergency records review into the microphone, flat and procedural, though every sentence landed like a verdict, confirmed discrepancies in the original procurement contract, confirmed authorship of the restoration drawings, confirmed pattern of exclusion against the architect who had raised the initial concerns. The vote, when it came, was 7-1 to preserve the River Street block in full and refer the procurement findings to the city's ethics office for formal investigation. Grant's single ally on the council cast the dissenting vote. Grant himself had resigned his seat 2 hours before the hearing began, his attorney releasing a brief statement about pursuing other opportunities that fooled no one in the room. Renee found Dean afterward in the hallway outside the chamber, waiting while Margot finished a round of questions from a local reporter. She looked older than Margot had ever seen her, some practiced ease finally worn through. "I didn't know," Renee said, "about the procurement thing. I want you to believe that." "I believe you didn't know the details," Dean said, not unkindly. "I think you knew enough not to ask." Renee absorbed that without argument, which was, Dean thought, the first honest thing she'd offered him in years. "I'm sorry," she said, "for all of it. Not just this." He nodded. Not quite forgiveness, not quite absolution, but something that let both of them set the weight down. She left without another word, and did not look back. And Dean understood that whatever chapter had once existed between them was finally, genuinely closed. 2 weeks later, the city held a small ceremony at the corner of River Street, more modest than the hearing had been, but somehow weightier for it. A bronze plaque unveiled at the base of the block's central building, listing Dean Ashford as architect of record, restoration completed and preserved for future generations. Margot stood beside him as the cloth came off the plaque, her commission badge catching the afternoon light, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Savannah, her title didn't feel like a costume. He looked at his name fixed permanently to the building he'd built and nearly lost twice, once to grief, once to a man who'd tried to erase him from his own history, and felt something in his chest finally unclench. A reporter asked him, gently, how it felt to see his name back on the block after so many years away from it. Dean thought about the question longer than the reporter probably expected, watching Milo chase a pigeon along the seawall a dozen yards off, watching Margot answer a council aide's question with the calm authority of a woman who had earned every inch of her title. "It feels like proof," he said finally, "that the truth doesn't need you to fight for it forever, just long enough." The reporter scribbled that down and moved on to someone else, and Dean stood there a moment longer, letting the afternoon settle around him, the river light, his son's laughter, the woman beside him who had risked her own career, rather than let his history stay buried. Margot reached over. without ceremony, without announcement, and rested her hand against his forearm, the same place she'd gripped in a doorway weeks earlier out of panic and instinct. This time her touch was slow, deliberate, asking nothing and claiming nothing, simply present. Dean looked down at her hand, then at her, and didn't move away. "No boxes this time," he said quietly. "No boxes," she agreed. "Just this." 3 weeks after the ceremony, on a Sunday too warm for early spring, Dean, Margot, and Milo walked the length of River Street at the hour when the light off the water turned the old brick gold. Milo ran ahead along the seawall, crouching every few yards to inspect some shell or bottle cap the tide had left behind, narrating his findings to no one in particular, with the total confidence of an 8-year-old, convinced every discovery was significant. "He likes you," Dean said, watching his son, "more than he's liked anybody I've brought around, which is to say, anybody. There hasn't been anybody, I noticed." Margot smiled, watching Milo hold up something that might have been a piece of blue sea glass. "I like him too, obviously." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the kind that no longer needed filling, past the buildings Dean had rebuilt with his own hands, and nearly lost to a man who'd never understood what any of it was worth. She thought of the folder she'd carried into his kitchen weeks earlier, of Opal's notebook, of Renee's silence in the back of that hearing room that had said more than words could have. All of it had led here, to an ordinary Sunday, to a boy chasing sea glass along a river that still remembered whose hands had saved it. Margot slowed near the doorway where, weeks earlier, she'd stopped him cold with 5 words she hadn't planned to say. "I meant it, you know," she said, that day. "I wasn't just talking about Renee, or the divorce, or any of it. I meant if things had been different. If I'd met you first. If I hadn't spent a decade only knowing you through my sister's version of the story." She shook her head slightly, half a laugh, half something more fragile. "I should have chosen you. You didn't have the chance to choose me back then." Dean stopped walking, faced her fully in the gold evening light. "You have it now." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small brass key, plain, unremarkable, worn smooth at the edges from years of use. He pressed it into her palm, closing her fingers around it gently. "To the workshop," he said, "where I keep every drawing I've ever made. Nobody's had that key but me since Catherine died. I'm not handing it to you because of the hearing, or the plaque, or any of it." His voice roughened slightly, the closest thing to vulnerability she'd heard from him yet. "I'm handing it to you because I want you to actually know me. All of it, not the surface label. Not the favor. Me." Margot closed her fingers around the key, throat tight, and didn't trust herself to answer in words, so she didn't try. She simply stepped closer, resting her forehead briefly against his shoulder, the two of them standing still on a street he'd built twice over, once with his hands, once with the truth. Milo came barreling back up the seawall just then, breathless, holding out a curved piece of sea glass like a trophy. "Look what I found!" He glanced between the two adults, registered nothing but happiness in whatever he saw on their faces, and grabbed a hand from each of them without asking permission, tugging them both forward down the sunlit street. "Come on," he said. "There's more up ahead." Neither of them let go. She hadn't come to help him move on. She'd come to help him move, and somewhere between the boxes and the doorway, she'd found the one thing she never meant to look for.